Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
U.S.-China relations in 2017. Okay, who would like to make some predictions? And if you did, what would you base them on? Especially in our current environment. Well, we are pleased to have with us this morning a gentleman who undoubtedly is in a better position to do that than any of us. David Firestein, as you have read, with a bachelor's degree from Georgetown and 2 master's degrees from the University of Texas in public policy and Asian studies, enjoyed a career as a U.S. diplomat from 92 to 2010, spending about half that time in either China or Moscow. His primary focus in these and other assignments dealt with communications. In fact, he was the first foreigner ever to have a column in a Chinese newspaper, the Beijing Youth Daily. A prolific author, he has written several books and numerous articles on China, on Chinese and Russian publications. One of his interests I found particularly of note relates to the political communication effect of American country music. In an article he wrote on, quote, the honky-tonk gap, unquote, is apparently considered a gem. For his innovative efforts, he won the prestigious Secretary of State's Award for Public Outreach in 2006. Today, David is a Perot Fellow and Senior Vice President for the East-West Institute, a New York City-based foreign policy and conflict resolution think tank, which specializes in Track 2 diplomacy and international trust building. And after this talk, we're going to have a quiz on the meaning of Track 2 diplomacy. A member of the Board of Governors of the American Foreign Service Organization, he's also an adjunct professor at the University of Texas, teaching graduate courses on U.S.-Russian relations and U.S.-Chinese relations. Please join me in welcoming David Firestein to the Ambassador's Roundtable.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Bass, thank you. Kay and Wendy, thanks so much for your help in being here. And thanks to all of you, above all, for the precious gift of your time this morning. It's turning out to be a gorgeous day, a lot sunnier and nicer than yesterday. I know I'm going to be competing with the backdrop behind me for your eyeballs and attention, and now I know that's why I'm not speaking from that side. But one thing is clear, there's a tremendous turnout today. I'm extremely grateful for that, and it's a testament to one thing that I think is obviously true. My reputation has not preceded me to this event. But let me just say that it's a real privilege to be here. It's my second time to be at the Stanford World Affairs Forum, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I know that time is of the essence, so I will get right into the topic, which I think has the value of bringing together a couple of things that are very, very timely. The topic of China, the topic of U.S.-China relations, the topic of the transition into the Trump presidency and the Trump administration, and all of these things have been in the news, and so I think there's probably not a more opportune moment to address the issue of U.S.-China relations and what U.S.-China relations are going to look like in 2017 and beyond as we enter this new presidency. Anyone that knows me knows that when I give a talk, I have no difficulty going long. So what I'm going to try to do is be uncharacteristically brief today, because I sense that the most interesting part of our discussion today is going to be the questions that many of you probably will have and the points that you'd like to make, and I certainly want to leave enough time for that. I wrote my notes for this talk planning on a 20 or 25-minute talk. I'm going to try to condense it down to about 15 minutes to leave the majority of time for you and for your questions and comments. But basically what I'd like to do is talk about 3 different points. Very briefly, just to talk a little bit by way of scene setting about the way that China was framed in the U.S. presidential campaign of 2016. Because I think it's important to understand where we've come from and where we are at this still transitional moment. Then I'll say a few words about kind of the substance of what I'd like to talk about, which is the issues on the agenda in U.S.-China relations at this transitional and sensitive moment, and what I think we might see as we go forward. And third, just a final concluding thoughts and takeaways. Now, let me note that the second section, which is kind of the heart and soul of the presentation, I think on my outline has about 23 different points, and each one has 5 subparts. But what I'll try to do is just be very brief and pick and choose a couple of things to talk about in the overriding interest of trying to preserve the most time for your questions and discussion. So with that, let me just say a few words about the first topic, which is sort of how China was framed in the US presidential campaign of 2016. This is an issue that I've tracked over the years. I'm fascinated by US politics, as I'm sure many of you are. This was a particularly interesting campaign, as we all understand. And one thing I've looked at is the way that China is discussed and framed by presidential candidates in this country during campaigns. And I've actually done quite a bit of research on that. But let me just share a couple of interesting points that I think set the backdrop to a discussion about the incoming Trump administration and what it means for US-China relations, what I think, or dare I say predict, it might mean for US-China relations. In the campaign, a couple of interesting data points. Number one, China was actually displaced to a pretty significant degree by a number of other major international issues during the campaign. So there is a narrative that you sometimes hear about and it's talked about how China was, quote, bashed during the campaign by various candidates. And in this analysis, some would say that candidate Trump was among the bashers and others were as well. But what's interesting is relative to 2012, China was not as central an issue actually as it was before. I say that having measured references and looked at and quantified references to China in debates, speeches, and things like that. So on the basis of firm, quantifiable data, I can tell you China did not come up to the same degree that it did 4 years ago. It came up more with the Republicans than it did with Democrats. And in fact, the 2 major long-lasting Democratic candidates, Secretary Clinton and Senator Sanders, made surprisingly little reference to China in the Democratic primaries. It was almost no reference. And in fact, Hillary Clinton only generally referenced China as a candidate when she was speaking about her credentials to be president, basically making the interesting argument, and I think a good argument, that having dealt with China as Secretary of State of the United States, she had, that was an example of the kind of qualifications that she brought to her candidacy and that she would bring to the White House. Note that she wasn't really commenting substantively on a lot of the substantive issues, but rather using China as a measuring stick for her qualifications for office. That was interesting and unusual. On the Republican side, there was a lot more reference to China, and that's measurable. And among the Republicans, no one mentioned China more than Donald Trump. Now, what's interesting about Donald Trump's references to China is that they were rather bifurcated. So, on the one hand, Donald Trump said something about China that no U.S. candidate for president in history had ever said before, as a matter of the searchable record. And that is, quote, "I love China," which is a phrase that he said many, many times during the course of the race. And as you think back to various candidates for president of either political party, no one has ever run on the platform of, "I love China." Not an easy thing to do in the context of American politics, but Donald Trump was unabashed in saying that he had great affection and, as he put it, love for China. He also said things like, that observed that, in his judgment, Chinese leaders are smarter than our leaders. They're eating our lunch in terms of the competition between our 2 countries. They are running circles around us in terms of trade and economic performance and so on. And so there were some positive framings on the part of Donald Trump as a candidate that were rather unusual and unconventional in the context of a U.S. presidential race. On the other side of the coin, he also certainly delivered a tough message with respect to China on the cluster of issues around trade, economics, and investment. And that's obviously known to all of us. He was very tough on Chinese trade practices. He was very tough on what he regarded as a one-sided trade relationship where there's an enormous U.S. deficit, which in fact there is, with China. And also, as he put it in his phrase, the fact that China had, quote, "perpetrated on the United States the greatest theft in all of human history," unquote. So a mixed message, if you will, from a leading candidate, ultimately the winner of the contest, on China. And I think a couple of things are remarkable before moving on to other topics. One is the fact that, again, there were some positive things said about China, which is not often reported in the narrative, but which were dominant in his remarks on China. And number two, there was a very bifurcated message. So it would be hard to say that, from an outside analytical standpoint, that Donald Trump was pro or against China per se. It was a little bit more mixed of a message than that. So those were some of the things that happened. And I think that it's fair to say that that the main framing, and this helps segue into the second and more substantive part of the talk, the main framing that Donald Trump employed as a candidate about China was to look at China through the trade and economic lens. Now, it brings to mind that old expression in the United States that when you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And when you are a businessman, you tend to approach bilateral relations predominantly, I think, through the prism of trade, economics, and investment. And so that's, I think, a natural thing, and that's what we saw with this particular candidate, who was coming from a business background rather than a policy or foreign policy or government background. So principally, Donald Trump's framing of China was about trade and economics, and it was about the unfairness and unidirectionality of the trade relationship today. And that teed up the issue for the general election, and also I think it sets the scene and sets the tone as we move into this to the Trump White House era, starting next week. Now, with that said, let me say a few points, make a few points about the substance of U.S.-China relations. And here I will be very brief because there's a long list of things that we could talk about. But let me offer 4 categories of issues to keep an eye on that I think more or less exhaust the U.S.-China agenda in terms of the types of issues that are now on the plate of the two countries and that are now on the plate of the incoming administration. And this is something I just sort of thought of as I was preparing for this talk. I hadn't used this particular framing or framework before, but the 4 categories, and I won't go into the exhaustive list of each issue under each category, are basically, number one, and I think foremost in the mind of the President-elect, bilateral economic issues. That's category number 1, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and I've referenced it already. And the second is bilateral non-economic issues. So issues that are self-contained within the U.S.-China relationship that are bilateral issues. They don't involve other countries, but they're not economic. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. A third one is what I would call regional issues, which are disproportionately security issues, principally in East Asia. So the regional cluster really is another way of saying, in this framework, the security cluster of issues that include, for example, the South China Sea and other issues like that. And then the fourth one is global issues. And global issues are things like climate change and scientific cooperation and things where the United States and China are involved, but so are many other countries or most other countries or all other countries of the world, and the issues themselves are not self-contained within the U.S.-China relationship. So within that framework, let me just touch on a couple of key points in the interest of being, again, very brief here, more than I would be if we had more time. In the bilateral economic issues cluster, the issue of U.S.-China trade is, I think, the dominant issue on the agenda of the incoming White House, and that's been telegraphed very prolifically by Mr. Trump and by his team. I think it's important to note that among the most significant trade-related nominations or appointments that the President-elect is intending to make or has already announced, the folks that are looking at U.S.-China trade tend to fall into the camp of being pretty tough on China, being pretty tough on Chinese, what they view as very unfair trade practices, tough on the issue of the deficit of jobs and outsourcing and so on. Here I'm speaking about people like Professor Peter Navarro, who is going to head up the newly established, to-be-established National Trade Council at the White House, which is, I think, going to be a very important and significant new body at the White House that looks at trade, and that obviously is going to be probably disproportionately focused on China. Peter Navarro is a distinguished academic whose most notable work in this context is a book called death by China. So it gives you a little bit of a between the lines sense for the kind of mindset of a critically important top advisor to the president-elect and soon-to-be president. And also a gentleman by the name of Mr. Lighthizer, who's been nominated to be the U.S. Trade Representative, who was Deputy USTR under President Reagan, and who's on the written record prolifically saying that the United States needs to be more protectionist. So I think there is a signal that on the issue of U.S.-China trade, this administration is going to be tougher on China than at least tonally, at least rhetorically, and perhaps in terms of actual actions than perhaps other administrations have been of either party. So that's probably going to be the dominant issue, and I think that the Chinese, for their part, recognize that that is probably going to become a particularly sensitive issue in the relationship at this time. Now, there are other things we could talk about within trade. There's trade, there's the deficit, which itself is a big problem. The last full year for which it was calculated, our deficit with China was $365 billion. That was in 2015. That's an official U.S. Commerce Department figure. So every day we trade with China, we're losing $1 billion, if you will, of the year. So that's an issue. There's the issue of market access. There's the issue of intellectual property rights, infringement, and so on. All of those issues are going to be front and center. Let me talk a little bit about the issue of bilateral non-economic issues. What do I mean by that? Probably two things mainly. Number one, human rights and democracy, that cluster of issues which has historically been on the U.S.-China agenda. And the fact is, very, very little was said about this set of topics in the campaign by anyone. There may have been, by my calculation, looking at debate transcripts when there were a lot of candidates in the field on both sides, especially on the Republican side, and looking at speeches and things like that, there may have been a total of 2 to 3 sentences in the entire campaign that touched on the topic of human rights by any candidate of either party. Total of 2 or 3 sentences at the most. So the issue set is out there, but I don't think it's going to figure prominently right now. Mr. Trump didn't say anything about this set of issues when he was running for president. Hasn't said much about it, even as president-elect. The other non-economic bilateral issue, however, has very much been in the news, and that's the issue of Taiwan. It's not the only other issue, but it's the only one I'll touch on here for purposes of time. All of us, I think, have read the stories about the unconventional phone call that took place between the president of Taiwan, Madam Tsai Ing-wen, and our president-elect. It was certainly a departure from past practice and from the norms that we've seen. But let me just make this point, because a lot of people often ask me whether that portends a substantial change in U.S. policy toward Taiwan or toward China. And obviously the two are very closely interlocked from a policy standpoint. If we have a major change in our policy toward Taiwan, that will by definition usher in a major change in our policy or our relationship with China and vice versa. But the point that I would make is, yes, that was a conventional thing to do, to accept that congratulatory phone call. But notably, when President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan transited through the United States just a couple of days ago through Houston in my native Texas, pointedly, the Trump administration did not have anyone meet with Tsai Ing-wen. Now, if one were looking at that phone call in December and predicting the future, or trying to predict the future, one might have said, boy, if the president-elect of the United States is willing to take a phone call from the Taiwan president, despite the protestations of China, et cetera, then what won't he do? But I think what this example shows is that while the president-elect is willing to push the envelope on certain issues, that he seemingly understands that you can go so far but no further. So I'll come back to that theme in a minute when I conclude, but the issue of Taiwan, for a number of reasons, is probably going to be more front and center in the relationship between the United States and China than what we've seen traditionally. Let me be very brief about the other two clusters. I talked about bilateral economic issues, bilateral non-economic. We can also talk about security issues that are principally regional, because China doesn't play a dominant role in global security issues per se. They don't seem to, but they certainly play a critically important role in East Asia. So things like the South China Sea, things like the East China Sea issue, dispute between China and Japan, which involves the United States because the United States is a treaty ally of Japan, etc. Those are issues that are going to come into play. During the campaign, candidate Trump didn't say a lot about those issues, but interestingly, in the transitional period, on a couple of the tweets, we've seen references to the South China Sea and to what the president-elect referred to as China's, I believe the term was massive militarization of the South China Sea. So I suspect that we're going to see some tensions around that issue. We can delve into that more in Q&A. Finally, there's the global issues. I won't go into this, but the global issues like climate change and like some of the other things that we have on the agenda are not as contentious. They're not easy issues, but they're not as politicized, they're not as political, they're not as contentious or sensitive in the U.S.-China relationship as others. Donald Trump thus far has not shown, rhetorically at least, a great emphasis, demonstrated that he's emphasizing those issues in a very pronounced way. I don't think those will be big problems as we go forward. Let me just conclude. That was a much more succinct version than I would give if we had more time. But let me offer a few final concluding thoughts and takeaways to just sort of wrap up and hopefully set the scene for your questions and comments. I think China is going to be a very important issue in this presidency. The U.S.-China relationship, which I regard and I think many regard as the most consequential U.S. bilateral relationship in the world, is going to become even more consequential. This is a sensitive and transitional moment, and that is that sensitivity of the moment that we're in on U.S.-China relations is amplified by the fact that this year, 2017, we actually now are going to see the Chinese political process play out with the 19th Communist Party Congress taking place this fall in Beijing. And though the political systems of our two countries are of course, extremely different, the fact is, in very broad terms, the analog of our election in the context of China is occurring this year in China with respect to the Party Congress and the transition of Politburo Standing Committee level leadership. Presumably not including Xi Jinping, but most of the rest of the top leadership will be rotated out. That creates a political dynamic in China that is probably going to complicate the relationship from the standpoint of their politics in much the same way that China was complicated and politicized in the context of our politics, though our systems are very different. I think we will see some increased tension on the issue of trade and economics in the relationship between the United States and China as we go forward. But the next thing I'll say may surprise some of you, and we can elaborate on it in Q&A, and that is that I actually predict that as the dust settles, and it will take some time to settle from this transitional period with the president-elect taking office next Friday, I actually think that we are likely to see more continuity than change in U.S.-China relations as we go forward. There are any number of data points to suggest that that may be an overly optimistic view or an overly cautious view. But the fact is, what we've seen repeatedly in both parties is that when candidates talk about China on the campaign trail, whether it was Bill Clinton in 1992, whether it was to a lesser degree George Bush as a candidate in 2000, Barack Obama in 2008, Hillary Clinton in her campaigns, although she didn't win, and so we can't test it against what she would have done as president. But in the cases where folks campaigned, referenced China, and became president, what we've pretty consistently seen is a tendency to come back to a pretty well-established body of policy that represents a bipartisan consensus in this country that has been in place since 1972. I suspect that in the main, generally, we're going to see more continuity than change. That said, where I think the flare-ups will likely be manifested to the extent that they are is probably in the trade area, and there will be continuing challenges around the South China Sea. Taiwan is out there. But the bottom line is, I think this is going to be a president focused on jobs, focusing on trade, focusing on outsourcing of manufacturing employment, and that cluster of issues. And that, I think, is going to be the principal theme in this relationship as we go forward. Finally, I would just say that I think this is an extremely important and timely moment to be looking at this relationship. I actually think Donald Trump is a president-elect and soon-to-be president who understands the importance of the relationship, which is one of the reasons he talked about it so much, more than any other GOP candidate, and almost more than all other GOP candidates combined, as you looked at the primary debate transcripts. I think that actually augurs well. And obviously the United States has a stake, a great stake, and all the American people have a great stake in the deft management of this critically important relationship. So with that, let me stop there. I hope that's a platform and a stepping stone into some questions and comments. There's a lot more that could be said, but I'll stop there. I'm grateful for your time, and I'll turn the floor over. Yes, sir, and then we'll come over to Gene.
In your judgment, what would it take for China to actually try to rein in its ally and close friend North Korea?
It's a very good question.
You could repeat the question.
Yes, in my judgment, what would it take for China to rein in its ally and close friend North Korea? Let me address that briefly. This is a topic that Donald Trump has touched on a number of times during the campaign and recently. I think that the situation with North Korea is more, that is the relationship between China and North Korea is more fraught and complex than many Americans understand. Some do, but many don't. There is, I think, a reflexive tendency to think that that China, by virtue of the fact that it essentially supports about 90% of the North Korean economy, can simply turn off the faucet and shut down North Korea, which it, in fact, could largely do, and therefore that it has enormous leverage and can get North Korea to do what China wants it to do. I understand that argument. I understand the logic behind it. But what I think that argument misses is the fact that if China were to do that, the resulting instability and perhaps collapse of the regime on its border, the North Korean regime, would have profound and deleterious implications for China, mainly in the form of, to put it simply, the likely collapse of the regime and a flood of millions or tens of millions of impoverished North Koreans into China, creating a human catastrophe of an order that we've maybe never seen in the world in recent years, involving tens of millions of people who are probably near death. So that's why I think China doesn't use all of the levers that it theoretically could use. And though I think I see China for what it is, and I understand how China looks at the world, and there are areas with Chinese policy where I certainly take a different point of view and I'm critical of the Chinese government. But on the issue of North Korea, I understand where they're coming from, because it's not quite as simple as it's often portrayed to be. So going to your question, I don't think that China de facto has the degree of leverage over North Korea that is generally presumed to be the case. If they did, North Korea wouldn't have nuclear weapons, which they do today. China doesn't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. North Korea is not on our border. North Korea is on China's border. China, I take absolutely at face value when they say that they share the U.S. and I think global goal and policy objective of a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula. And they're the last ones that would want to see a nuclear weapons holding North Korea. But the fact is, precisely because China is unable to exert the kind of leverage that people from the outside presume that China can exert, we've seen the developments we've seen on the Korean Peninsula. And I actually think China is like-minded with respect to the United States on the fundamental objective. But admittedly, there are some pretty significant differences between the United States and China with respect to how you achieve that objective. And the simple reality is none of us have achieved the objective. We've all failed, because the reality is that North Korea has a certain small number of nuclear devices or weapons. So this is a failure on our part, it's a failure on China's part. The six-party talks, it's a failure of the six-party talks process. But in short, I don't think the situation is as simple as it is sometimes described. G, and then we'll come over.
My question was just preempted by the question just asked. But question number two is, there's been a pivot in American foreign policy towards Asia as a region. Do you expect that emphasis to continue in the incoming administration? And if not, what might be the ramifications?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And the short answer is I think it will continue de facto, if not de jure, if not in name. The reality is I believe this pivot to Asia or rebalancing to Asia that was a major Obama administration initiative will continue in its effect. And the reason I believe that is because I think Donald Trump understands that Asia is the overseas engine outside the United States that is going to disproportionately drive American growth and prosperity. And this is a president-elect who is very focused on the economy, on jobs, on getting, quote, better trade deals. And this is someone who recognizes, I think, that China, Japan, who Donald Trump also mentioned frequently during the campaign, and other Asian nations are at the heart of global economic trends that ultimately affect very substantially U.S. economic interests. Because our economic interests lie disproportionately in Asia, I think the notion of remaining engaged in Asia and staying very much sort of focused on the Asian region, particularly from an economic standpoint, I think that is going to continue to be front and center as a policy priority of this administration. They may not call it the same thing that the Obama administration called it, but underneath the nomenclature is the realization that from an economic standpoint, no part of the world is more important to the United States. And secondly, if you frankly calculate it, and this has been noted by other leaders of the United States, more Americans have died in Asia in wars than in Europe. And we fought more wars in Asia than we fought in Europe. We fought World War II, yes, but we also fought Korea and we fought the Vietnam War. And the fact is, from an economic and security standpoint, Asia is the critical place. Let me actually come over to this side of the room and I'll try to get as many questions in. Yes, sir, in the very back.
Thank you. Would you share with your insight and thought of the trilateral relationship between Russia, China, and the United States?
Well, yes, sorry. Can I share some thoughts on the trilateral relationship between Russia, China, and the United States? And those are the countries I work on. I work on U.S.-China relations and U.S.-Russia relations. I don't know what I did in a past life to deserve to work on both of those relationships at the same time, but I must have had a good time doing it. It's a very interesting dynamic. Geopolitically, I think you tend to see a lot of alignment between Russia and China. Historically, that has been a relationship that has underperformed in a number of different measures, but just to use one data point as an illustration of the kind of feebleness of that relationship, up until very recently, these were two of the top 10 economies in the world. China, of course, now is number 2. But they had one of the smallest bilateral trading relationships of any pairing of top 10 countries on the earth. An absolutely anemic level of bilateral trade until very recently, and now it's at a more moderate level, but it's a tiny fraction, a small fraction of U.S.-China trade. There's historical distrust, there's been historical animosity, there's some history and some bad blood there. So while the relationship between China and Russia has improved in recent years, and it has, partly out of a dynamic of triangulation relative to the United States and the enemy of my enemy is my friend and that kind of mindset, the reality is I think there is a glass ceiling above which that relationship is not going to rise for historical reasons. But it is a better relationship than it was. It's more robust. There's a greater level of trade. And they tend to vote the same way on some of the big geopolitical issues in the United Nations and so on. So I think there's an interesting dynamic. But I also think that each of the bilateral relationships in the triangle, whether it's U.S.-China, U.S.-Russia, or Russia-China, has its own dynamics. And ultimately, it's those bilateral dynamics that tend to drive the overall dynamics in the triangle. That's a short answer. Yes, sir, over here, and then we'll go around.
There's a notion in the conventional media that the phone call from Taiwanese president to president-elect was something that was encouraged, invited, or almost demanded by the Trump cabinet. Do you believe that, and what are the implications of that?
So let me just say at the outset, I don't have direct knowledge of it, and I have to preface what I say by saying that, and then it allows me to offer my theory of what happened from an outside perspective. My guess is that it probably was something like this, and I'll just put on the voices of people within the Trump camp. Mr. President-elect, there's been an effort on the part of the Taiwanese president to reach out to you and offer her sincere congratulations on your victory, sir. I have to tell you, whoever the advisor was talking, have to tell you, sir, that to take the call would be a departure from past practice. U.S. presidents-elect and presidents don't speak directly with the Taiwan leader because of strictures in our policy. But I also have to let you know that there's a desire to speak to you, and so, sir, that's the situation. And I'm guessing that the president-elect said, I'll take the call. I don't mean that positively or negatively. I think that it was sort of that type of discussion. And Donald Trump has shown that he is someone who is willing to do things very differently than conventional or traditional candidates and presidents-elect, and probably that would be true as president. And I think my reading is that he probably had some knowledge, which is consistent with what he and what the campaign has said, that it wasn't that they made a blunder and just didn't know what was going on. I don't think that was the case. But I think that the president-elect made a judgment call that he wanted to do things slightly differently than his predecessors had done, took the phone call, understood that there would be some flack for the call, and then went on to the next issue. What I think is notable, as I referenced earlier, is the fact that when given the perfect opportunity to go to the next level with the transit of President Tsai Ing-wen in the United States, in Houston, to go en route to Central America, and again, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas and Governor Greg Abbott of Texas did meet with Tsai Ing-wen. When given the chance to do that, the Trump team, including the president-elect and his team, demurred. They declined to meet with the president-elect, with President of Taiwan. So I think there is a cognizance that there are things you can push and there are things that you don't push. And I read that as encouraging, and I read that as, here's a president who will do things when he takes office next week differently, but who understands that there are certain red lines that are probably best not crossed. So that's my take on what happened. And if I were a betting man thinking about the future, I don't think we're going to see a fundamental change in U.S. policy toward Taiwan. I think what we're going to see ultimately is more continuity than change with respect to that very sensitive issue, but a little bit of pushing of the envelope at the margins. Ma'am.
Could you address the situation of China's incursions into the South China Sea? What do you think in terms of where they're going, and what do you feel Trump people might, how would they respond?
Well, it's a great question, and the question is about China's incursions into the South China Sea and how the Trump administration might respond. And it's a big topic. I've done a number of full 60-minute speeches just on the issue of the South China Sea. To condense it down to only 59.5 minutes, what I would say is it's a very complex issue, but when you distill it down to its essence, the reason that the South China Sea issue has not generated conflagration, warfighting in the South China Sea, and the reason that I don't think it will, is because the United States has a stated interest. In fact, it was Secretary Clinton, as Secretary of State, who in 2010 most fully and forcefully articulated the U.S. interest in freedom of navigation. That is to say, the United States is not a claimant to any of the land or water in the South China Sea. we don't think any of that belongs to us, right? So it's not, we don't, as we say in Texas, have a dog in that hunt. That said, we do take an interest in freedom of navigation because about $5 trillion of international trade, a lot of it directed to or from the United States, flows through those waters. And so freedom of navigation is something that we've drawn a line, if you will, in the water and said this matters to us. But here's my point, and it's a point that's not often made, but it is demonstrably true. And that is that the Chinese have in fact not hindered U.S. freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, basically, at all. So that's the reason we're not actually fighting about the issue. If the United States were, if China were trying to block the United States from having access to certain segments or parts of the South China Sea, which are legally high seas in which we are as entitled as anyone else to sail commercial ships or military vessels or others, we would have a problem with that, and rightly, and so would anyone else. But the fact is, whatever China's doing, and they've done a lot, they're not actually impeding freedom of navigation. They're building out islands, which they claim. Others also claim those islands. But the point that sometimes gets lost in this discussion is that the United States doesn't lay claim to any of the land or water. So whatever island happens to be out there in the water or land feature, we're not claiming it. We recognize that there is a dispute between China, for that matter Taiwan as well, which has a claim that is coterminous with that of China, Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia. We recognize somebody owns that island. Somebody should rightly own that island, but it's in dispute as to who. But if you play that forward and assume for the sake of argument that ultimately it gets resolved and someone owns the island, and it might be China that ends up owning it under some theoretical agreement, I'm making this point to make an intellectual point, then we don't have a problem with that. What we do have a problem with is anyone impeding freedom of navigation, which generally the Chinese, despite the sometimes provocative actions that they've taken, have not actually done. So bottom line is, I don't think that we're going to see a fundamentally different approach from the Trump administration to the South China Sea issue, so long as China's actions remain limited to what they have been limited to, which is building out some contested islands. I don't condone that. No, the United States condones what they're doing. But the reason we're not fighting over it is because they're not actually impeding our interests. So that's a short answer.
Last question.
One more question.
Yes, sir.
The word love is a very intense word. In your research, is there anything that suggests that there are transactions or involvements between Trump and China that would suggest that the word love is appropriately being used?
Is there a particular reason or set of relationships or connection between Trump and China that undergirds his use of the intense word love when describing his feelings for China? The short answer is I don't think so. I think this is a man who, again, reading in the press like all of us do, who speaks in more emotional and sometimes hyperbolic terms than many, and it gravitates toward an intense language in ways that other political figures generally don't. So I personally don't read anything nefarious or anything more into the use of the term. I think my reading from the outside is I think that Donald Trump has feelings of affection and respect for this country, for China. He respects their leadership, although to my knowledge I don't think he has met their leadership. To my knowledge he's been to Hong Kong but not to anywhere else in the mainland. But I think from a distance he has respect for what China has achieved. And I think that translates in his parlance and language to words that are less commonly used by other politicians. So to answer your question, I'm not aware, nor do I presume that there's anything more to it than just tending toward a more intensive type of verb than other politicians.
No deal. There are no deals.
I mean, my understanding, you know, and as was noted during the campaign, is that this is someone who sits atop a multi-billion-dollar empire, and a lot of the things that are made under the Trump label are made overseas. I think some of those are probably made in China and elsewhere. Some are made in the United States. But I don't perceive or have any knowledge that there's anything more to it than that. So I think it's just one thing we as a country, I think, and as citizens of our country and voters are going to have to get used to is just a very different style of presidential communication. And one thing that in this country we're going to have to get, that in China people are going to have to get used to is a very different style and modality of presidential communication that involves a lot more Twitter than we've seen in the past. But it's going to be an interesting time. I am, let me close now, I know I have to, with one phrase that I'll modify a little bit. I'm cautiously pessimistic about the relationship, but what I like that phrase, but what I really mean is I'm actually quite a bit less pessimistic in reality than a lot of people are about what we're going to see in the next 4 years and what we're going to see in the U.S.-China relationship. I actually think there is a chance, and a reasonable chance for a good and strong U.S.-China relationship to emerge and to develop, and I'm hopeful that that's what we'll see in the next several years. Thanks so much. Really appreciate your time.